Today on CityCast DC, stand right, walk left. Call it national, not Reagan. DC has a whole host of rules that are the kind of thing where if you know, you know. But there is disagreement, even among longtime DC residents. ClockoutDC's Jade Womack and Greater Washington's Dan Reed take me to school on the essential rules to life in the district. Today's Tuesday, August 13th. I'm Bridget Todd, and here's what DC is talking about. Jade, Dan, thank you so much for being here.
Hey.
Thank you for having us.
Okay, so we're all folks who have lived in DC for kind of a while, and I think you live anywhere long enough, you kind of get these unofficial rules to life in your city. I do feel strongly that there are rules to living in DC, and when I see somebody who seemingly does not know the rules, I'm like, doesn't this person know the rules? But we don't want to make it seem like we're saying, if you don't do X, Y, Z, we're going to call the police and like, the DC police is going to take you away, right?
I would hope not, because I probably would be taken away too. And I'm from the area.
So how are you two thinking about, when you think about essential rules to life in DC, how are you two thinking about them? How do they play out for you?
I like to think of them as almost like a secret handshake, right? You know, there's a stereotype that DC is this very transient place and no one is from here. But like, statistically speaking, most people who live here live here. So it's, you know, somebody who grew up here, it's a way that I can sort of welcome people in, right? Like, here's a thing that you can know as someone who wants to put down roots here and build life here and become a part of this community.
So should we get into some of what you think of as the unofficial rules of DC? I should also say right off the top that we don't all have to agree. We're all longtime Washingtonians, but we might not all agree on what are the essential rules for DC, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I mean, we can just throw out the first one, which is the most obvious one, right? Which is that you stand on the right, you walk on the left. Like that one is probably the most unofficial, like the most popular unofficial rule in DC if you were to ask anyone.
No, it is the way to spot a tourist on the metro, right? Like if they are standing on the left-hand side of the escalator and you can see people behind them, people are getting impatient. Like it's always an indicator that somebody has not learned.
Okay, so I 1000% agree with you. I think that's like a hard and fast rule that everybody should be following. However, just to push back a little bit, I am just finding out that a University of Maryland researcher just put out a report saying that rule that we all live our lives by might not actually be the best. We actually covered it in a recent roundup on this podcast, but apparently that rule might actually slow us all down. What are your thoughts on this?
What do they say we should do instead?
Oh, here's Priyanka. She knows more about it than me. She was telling me this, and I was shocked hearing this or seeing her type this.
Yeah, producer Priyanka here. So yeah, we saw this report from this UMD researcher, Michael Fu, basically saying that because there are more standers than walkers in DC on average, especially at peak transit times, you end up having all of these people who are waiting to get on the escalator to stand on the right. And you have a very few people walking up the left, but it ultimately leads to all of this congestion and leads to us getting out of the metros slower. And so he recommends that, especially again at peak transit times, we should just all be loading up onto the escalator, 2 people at a time, filling up both rows, and everyone will clear out of the station faster that way. So I don't know. It's a very controversial theory, but if it's what the science says.
Well, DC isn't really known for getting things done quickly. So to me, it seems culturally appropriate that we will be standing on the right and walking on the left.
What is the expression? A city of northern charm and southern efficiency?
That's right.
I guess another rule while we're in this metro space is I think you should know how to use the metro. You should know a basic way of getting a smart trip card, using the metro, probably knowing your bus lines around you. I don't want to look down at people that don't, but it's not interesting that you never use the metro. Like a lot of people do. And so knowing how the metro works, I think is just an essential rule of living or at least being in DC.
Yeah, I have a vivid memory of like living at home after college and my mom waking up one morning to my mom explaining to my dad, who for much of his career worked next to Union Station, how to use the metro. Because he has lived here since 1987 and prides himself on having only ridden it twice.
Wow. That being a source of pride for him is really something.
Weird flex.
That was the day of the Fort Totten crash, so you can bet he will never ride the metro again.
Wow. Okay, what about people who only do Metro and they're like too good for the bus?
Missing out.
The bus is the best people watching. There's a lot of reflection that happens on the bus. I highly recommend it.
And you have better cell service too.
Absolutely.
And also, in some ways, it's much more efficient to use the bus. Like, I live in Union Market. To get to Adams Morgan, it's the most jarring way to go on the red, to hop up maybe to the green and walk a bit or whatever. And it's instead the bus, it's door to door. So why not?
Mm-hmm.
I would also add, if you're using any kind of public transit, I mean, this isn't a rule for DC, but it's just a rule for when you use it. Let people get off first before you get on. I also would argue that I don't know what y'all's temperature is on this. I feel like we've had a little bit of a breakdown on Metro rules recently. Like in the era after we were all in our houses because of COVID, I feel like people have kind of like could use a little bit of a refresher on the rules of public transit and how you're supposed to behave, how you're supposed to act.
Yeah, people have to learn how to live in a society again. We've gone a little feral at home.
Once you're on a crowded metro or a crowded bus, do you have any rules for how people should be taking up space on those public transits?
I don't know if this is a DC rule per se, but like priority seating for people that are clearly need seats. And like when you're about to go to a major hub like Metro Center or Gallery Place, Shanghai, LaFont, like if you're staying, move on in. If you're just standing by the doorway, it's not going to help anybody. Just like, I feel like those are some basic ones, but I feel like they would apply too if you were in New York City or Chicago. So I don't know if it's a DC hard rule, but maybe for a lot of people moving to the city who've never experienced a metro system, these are rules to adapt to.
Oh, totally. And if you have a bag with you, like your backpack, put it on your lap. Don't put it on the seat next to you. If somebody wants to sit next to you, like move your stuff.
Yes, I can't tell you how many times. This is like a specific gripe to me. When you're on like a shuttle, when you're taking a flight, and there's not a lot of room and everybody's cramming in, and you can just tell people who have never lived in urban environments because they've got their backpack on, their purse in the seat. They're trying to be noble by not taking the seat that's next to them. So it's just an empty seat, plus their body is taking up space. I will just seethe the entire ride while I'm watching people do a bad job of taking up space in a shared resource.
Yeah, well, not to pivot, but I think, Dan, you were mentioning something about your dad only using the metro twice. I would also say this applies to museums. I feel like if you're one unofficial in DC is that you gotta like museums. Not going to the Smithsonian again does not make you interesting. I don't know. I think that's the one thing that I've interacted with people who just don't go to museums. They don't go to any festival or culture, and that is just shocking to me. But maybe I don't know if that's a rule per se, but
oh, totally. I took it for granted living here growing up that like museums are free. And when I moved to Philadelphia and I was like, you have to pay for the museum, I was shocked. Because, ideally you sort of follow that habit. Like this is this amazing free cultural amenity that you can just go to. You shouldn't waste it.
And I think it's something uniquely DC because whenever I tell people that the museums are free, they are shocked. And so that is something that I feel like is a unique to DC experience of the museums being this amazing cultural resource that is also free. So speaking of free, I think people think of DC as being pretty expensive, and they're not wrong. But we actually do have like low cost resources, happy hours, museum events, cultural events. Are there any unofficial rules to DC life that pertain to how to get a better deal, how to have a good night out on the cheap? What folks should know about that?
I think one of the benefits of living in a place with a lot of political stuff and political events is there's always some think tank talk or random organization happy hour that will have an open bar or something like that. And if you can schmooze your way in or scav off of your friend who is going, do it. It's a great way to have free food and meet new people.
I would say also, I guess this is maybe like a post-pandemic thing now that everything has a free time pass that you have to reserve. So like if you're not a planner, you just start becoming one because you really have to start thinking, 2 or 3 weeks out, because anything from going to Jazz in the Garden with the lottery to now, like, which is something that I think is a quintessential DC thing to do, visiting the zoo even nowadays, the Air and Space Museum, like a lot of things now need pre-reserved passes. And so I think the unofficial rule for DC is we really have to think 3 weeks out, or I think before there was maybe more spontaneity.
Oh, that's news to me. That sounds stressful.
It is.
So this explains why every weekend I'm like, why don't I have anything to do? It's because I haven't thought it through.
And I understand why. I think because it helps organizers know, like, head counts and things. But, there's probably a huge triage of like 50%, 50% of people actually show up to things. But that being said, when tickets go live, a lot of things sell out very quickly, it seems. Like, for example, Ren Festival is coming up in August. And last year that sold out within, like, I think the first 2 weeks that they put tickets out on sale, even before the event began. So you have to really think ahead. I think that's just planning. DC is a city of planning. But actually, Bridget, I have just a question. How do you feel about what do you do? That is such a, like, you're not supposed to ask people what they do. And you are a podcast host. So please indulge.
So we were talking about maybe not agreeing with the rules. This is a rule that I actually don't really agree with nor live by. I am a podcaster, and when people are like, oh, what do you do? Sometimes when you say, I'm a podcaster, people are like, that is the coolest thing ever, tell me everything. Sometimes I can visually see people's face, like, judging me, and they think that I'm, like, in my basement, and, they think all the things that they think, and they're not totally wrong. But Michael Schaefer and I talked about this on an episode. I think DC is a city of people who are passionate about what they do, and I think passion is great. And I actually don't think it's necessarily some sign of, like, oh, you're trying to be a climber and a schmoozer because you're asking somebody what they do. I love finding out what people do. So that's not a rule that I really agree with. But what do you all think?
I feel like it's one of those, like, stereotypes about DC, not just the question, but that, like, people have this ulterior motive about the question. Because I don't think it's that unique to hear people asking what people do. And I think it's a maybe less insidious version of the other question that cities are often stereotyped as asking is, where did you go to high school? Which I think the way it's been described to me, like, this is when I lived in Philly, it's like, this is, where you went to high school is a way for people to sort of, like, sort you as, like, socioeconomic level, maybe even ethnic or racial background, or, like, who do you know, right? Like, in some ways that seems worse than where do you work or what do you do?
Yeah, no, I would, it's interesting. I kind of related this New York Times article I was reading about, like, unofficial social partying rules. I think it was Molly Jong Fast who said something like, in New York, people will pretend not to know you, but in DC, they will definitely pretend to know you. And maybe fitting to that stereotype of, like, what do you do and, like, how you could be of use to me, I guess, or something of this. But I agree with you. I think I've changed. I think before I thought I was like, why do people want to know what we do? Like, isn't there more to me than my job title? But now I view it as like, wow, like, people do such interesting things, and they, so many people come to the city to do things they're passionate about. And, it's great to learn about what people, what keeps them up at night and, like, what they're interested in.
Well, that goes back to the rule around don't say nice to meet you, say nice to see you, in case
Every
you actually
time.
What do y'all think? What are your thoughts? Dan, it seems like you've got an opinion.
I, in fact, this week encountered somebody who said, it's good to meet you. And I'm like, not only have we met before, but I'm going to tell you the, like, date and location of where we met. In a nice, polite way, of course, but people do not forget those things. So you always say, it's good to see you again.
Yeah, I mess up with this a lot. I maybe this is a get out of jail free card. I'm just like, I had long COVID for a while. My memory was bad. I'm so sorry. Like, it's not that you're not important or you're, like, a face to the sea. I'm just, yeah, like, there's just a part of 2022, 2023 is a little blurry right now. Yeah.
Yeah. The one thing that will trip me up is if I don't know if I met somebody online or in person, which, for the past few years is kind of the same thing. I
have to shout out my friend Sadie, DC resident, who just wrote a book called Do I Know You? About her life in DC with literal face blindness. So part of me is like, okay, you have a ready-made excuse to be like, I don't remember you. I don't know your face. I can't place you.
That's really interesting. And a good reason. It would shut me up.
Right. Okay, so I have to ask about this rule. What are your thoughts about the unofficial DC rule around not dating somebody who lives across the river from you? What are your thoughts?
As somebody who lives in Maryland, I feel like I do not benefit from
Yeah,
this.
you're like, I would never get dates.
In facts, it is. I have been on so many last dates with people who I invite to Silver Spring, where I live, which famously is on the metro and several bus routes that go to DC. It's just too far. It is ironically easier for me to date people in Virginia than in DC, even though I could walk to DC from my house.
Well,
Jade?
you know what? Well, I'm currently dating somebody in Arlington. And thank God they have a car because
Respect.
I know, right? I'm like, I think I visited Virginia the most this year solely because of this person. I think last year I went to Arlington 6 times. So I don't know if that's a weird flex at all, but like that's like the most I've crossed the river. So I think, well, it's not like there's a rule, like there's something wrong with people in Virginia or Maryland. I think it's more the convenience because people live in DC. They probably have made modifications to their lifestyle, whether it's not having a car or like, living in neighborhoods where they can walk to the supermarket, where they can do stuff. So the idea of dating somebody far away, it's just probably not fit into their current, I don't know use the word routine, but like I have a dog, for example. So I'm thinking like as somebody without a car, if I go there, like what are the trade-offs of how much time to travel there, coming back, and to do it in a way that like doesn't break the bank because dating is already very expensive.
Yeah, no, that's real. I think the ideal for me is someone who lives just close enough that it's easy to get to their house, but not too close that if things go south, I never have to see them again.
That's very real.
Like, we can't go to the same grocery store.
Dan, I have to tell you, I used to live in Tacoma Park, and when I lived there, I was always complaining. I'd be like, people say they don't want to come here. It's just a mile from the city, people. Georgia Avenue's right there. It's not that far. And then when I moved into the district, you better believe I never went to Tacoma Park again. So it's like funny, like when you live there, how you're like so indignant about it, but then when you're not there, you're like, I probably wouldn't make that trek.
And even in the quadrants within DC, right? Like, I live in Union Market, luckily it's on the red line, so I can go visit my friends in Northwest. But to get some of my friends in Northwest to come over to sunny, friendly Northeast, it's also a struggle too. So
yeah, I would totally date someone who lives in Union Market on the red line. The Hill, even though it's not that much farther away, like, I don't want to switch trains.
Well, that's actually another good rule. Know your quadrants. Don't wind up in Northeast when you're supposed to be in Northwest.
I would say just knowing DC history too. Like if you're going to move here, please know a little bit about the adopted city that you're in. Like I think a lot of people here that come to DC, they have lots of opinions and lots of viewpoints about how they want to solve so many of the national challenges. But when it comes to local politics, such as like what should be the education budget, or how do we feel about the mayor's budget on X, or like should we be prioritizing bike lanes or whatever, people really are not as informed or curious to be informed in their adopted city. And so I would just say maybe a rule is like, if you're moving to DC, please take a little bit of time, whether it's listening to CityCast.
Oh, nice plug.
Yeah, there we go. There, of course. Or just, following up a Washington City paper. There's such great local journalists doing great stuff.
Yeah, I definitely second that. It is amazing the amount of brain power that we have in this region devoted to solving the world's problems. And like, all of it is focused on somewhere else functionally.
I've noticed that throughout this conversation, we've just been saying DC, DC, DC. That might be another rule. I don't think that people really refer to it as Washington, DC. And I also think that we're sticklers about the names of things. I don't think I've ever heard anybody call DCA Reagan National Airport ever. I don't think I've ever heard that in conversation.
No.
Never. That is like I feel like a noob thing, not to call it national. I think like old school DC, like before any of us were alive, would call it Washington, but with like the accent, right? So it'd be more like Washington.
Mm-hmm. And that actually reminds me of what we were talking about, Dan. So before we started recording, if you had asked me what people refer to Meridian Hill Park as, what do you think I would have said?
Meridian Hill Park.
Well, I would call it Malcolm X Park. And in my mind, I'm like, oh, well, anybody who is anybody in DC calls it Malcolm X Park. But Dan, you were talking about how your family has lived next to that park for decades, and that's not what y'all called it.
Yeah, my family came here from the Caribbean in the late 60s, early 70s. They lived next to it. They lived in a building called the Park Meridian. And growing up, I only ever heard it called Meridian Hill Park. And it wasn't until I was an adult, in college or after, that I first heard somebody say Malcolm X Park.
So that's definitely a rule that, I don't know, it just really opened my eyes to the fact that I have been maintaining this as a hard and fast district rule and, getting a little bit of perspective from the Washington of generations ago who might not have felt the same way.
I mean, for example, though, too, right? Noma was never called Noma, right? And it was called maybe Union Market District or Admo versus Adams Morgan. I mean, there's so many ways in which the names of things have also evolved too.
Yeah. There, especially I think now as the city has grown, there are neighborhood names that sort of had gone out of use but came back, like Parkview. That is a historical name that wasn't used for a long time and is now commonly used again.
And then there's some that aren't used, such as Lanier Heights, which was my old neighborhood, which lives between Adams Morgan and Mount Pleasant. I thought Austin Graff, great person to follow on Instagram. He was doing a neighborhood guide for all the neighborhoods in DC, and Lanier Heights is this little small, maybe 5 blocks wide. And I was like, good luck with the guide. Maybe these are some, here's the one restaurant in Lanier Heights, but it's because most people would refer to it as Adams Morgan.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about different unofficial rules to DC. Are there rules that you wish existed for the city or maybe that you would like to steal or adopt from other cities?
Ooh. I would like the rule about not crossing the river to change. I'd love to meet somebody.
Well, one rule that I know from living in New York is that if you see a celebrity on the street, you're supposed to be like, there's Sarah Jessica Parker, who cares? And I wonder if there's a DC version of that rule. If you see Joe Biden or Kamala Harris on the street, that you just got to be like, oh, okay, there they are.
I feel like a lot of the really big, powerful political people, you wouldn't know their face.
I think this DC has no chill when it comes to celebrities. That's been my experience.
Yeah, I even when I lived in New York, I never followed the pretend you don't care rule. If I see somebody on the street, I'm running up to them, I'm getting a picture, I'm that's me. I will claim that energy.
That's right. That's the magic of living here, is these are people who are their job theoretically is serving people, right? So
yeah, I mean, that's just one of the things that I think makes DC special. The people who are making decisions and presumably helping us live better lives, both here in DC and nationally. You could see them around, and that's the experience of life in DC. It's something that we shouldn't take for granted. Well, if you are listening and you're thinking, I have an unofficial rule of DC, or I wish this was an unofficial rule of DC, reach out to us, let us know. Maybe we'll make it a rule. Maybe we'll have a campaign to be like, this is the new rule of DC, and if you do not follow it, they will take you away. Jade, Dan, thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
That's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, share it with your friend who maybe needs a crash course on the rules of DC. We'll be back tomorrow morning with even more news from around the city. Talk to you then.